So today I'm going to do a front kick tutorial. I'm going to go over the technique of the move, some examples of it being used successfully in competition, various moves that work well in conjunction with a front kick, and some drills that you can do to improve your front kick. Now, the first thing that I would like to address with the front kick is that I believe it's a bit of a misunderstood move, in the sense that a lot of people, when they're first learning martial arts, depending on whatever style that they're in, they will do it against the air, you know, quite early on in their training, and the form will be fine, the execution will be fine, and you'll be hard pressed to find a fault with a front kick that they've done. So from that perspective, people sometimes think of it as a basic move when it's done against the air and under no pressure. However, when you look at combat sports, if you look at the highest levels of Muay Thai and kickboxing, you'll see, depending on the competitive style, this can often determine the bout. And you know, you're talking at the highest levels, they start training when they're 7, they peak training when they're 25, or you know, it can be later, whatever, but it's just a very high level. And you see the front kick often determines the outcomes of bouts at this level. Now, when you look at lower level combat sports, such as like amateur MMA, amateur Muay Thai, amateur kickboxing, I've seen a number of bouts at this level. And I would say if there's one move that I had to pinpoint as being executed most poorly, I would probably think as a front kick as a #1 move. Simply because competitors tend to do it, you know, they do it when they're running out of ideas is part of it. But the actual execution of the front kick is badly timed, there's no power on it. Usually they'll do it, it'll land down against the air and it'll do nothing to stop them getting bombed on. Or they'll do it, they'll take it slightly, but there's so little power in it, they'll say catch it and sweep the other leg away. So when you're talking about amateur combat sports, I would say compared to something like an overhand right or a left hook, then I would say the front kick can be quite an advanced move. And the matter of getting a perfect front kick can take obviously a long time to develop. It's a little bit like a jab in boxing, because it's not just about physical attributes, it's about timing and power and skill. Because for instance, Mike Tyson, who's quite a common example, if you look at his bouts, he's like 5'10" and he's out jabbing people who are 6'4". And the same can occur with front kicks as well. So to get into the technique of the front kick, it can be done as either a push or a snap or somewhere in between the two. So to start, if I'm going to be kicking with my front leg, I'll point the back leg at 45 degrees, then I'll bring my knee up, chamber the kick, and then if I'm going for the snap variation, then I'll mainly pivot at the knee and snap. And then if I'm going for the push kick variation, then I'll try and use more of my butt and hips and just try and engage into it. If you saw my front kick on the intro, then you'll see I emphasize the push version of it. Later on, I'm going to show a few clips of Semmy Schilt, because he's won a few bouts using this move and he's won by TKO using the snap variation of it. Again on the bag, the knee raises and the kick goes out. One drill that I like to do when I'm practicing front kicks is to kick the bag, and then as the bag swings back without putting my leg down, just practicing the check and blocking the kick. This is a good way of both conditioning your shin, depending on how hard the bottom of the bag is. Usually it's a bit harder than the top, for instance. So I'll just give you a sort of gentle, incremental way of conditioning your shin without being too hard, such as going like full shin on shin sparring. It'll be, I think, worth it without being too hard. And also it's a good way of testing your balance, both with the front kick and with the check, because potentially it could happen in a scenario where you've gone for a front kick and then your opponent's immediately countered with a roundhouse kick to your leg, and you don't really have enough time to get your leg back and down. So that will look roughly something like this. is if you find a wall such as this, and then you place your leg on it, and you just drill the snap. Now that's going to be different to doing leg extensions on the gym, at the gym, where you're training the muscles, say 4 sets of 10. Here you're really training the brain mainly, because you're training the brain to remember what that snap feels like, what combination of muscles and neurotransmitters you're going to need to execute that snap. So when it comes time to use it in competition, there'll be a muscle memory there in the motor skills center in the brain, and it'll fire off much faster because the signals will just do it. And so your reaction will be much faster when it comes to doing it in competition. Now in terms of this, where at the gym you might do say 4 sets of leg extensions, I would say in terms of this, I would do maybe 2 sets of 100 per day, and I'm confident that within a month you'll see. So one thing that's worth considering with the front kick is that the ease with which you can use it is heavily dependent on the stance that you're using. So the best stance for doing the front kick is a stance where there's a lot of weight on your back leg, and the leg that you're going to be wanting to do the front kick with is very light. There's not really much weight on it. And it can also be used effectively from a stance where there's an equal distribution of weight between both legs. When you start getting into sort of deeper stances, such as a boxer looking to use a lot of head movement, or like a Shotokan stance, then it gets harder. And probably the hardest stance would be like from such as a wrestler stance, where you're very deep. If you just see how hard it is for me to lift my leg off the ground here, it's much harder than when I was like that, for instance. And one other, it's not really a stance, but a movement pattern, is the bouncing footwork. It can be quite hard to use the front kick from the bouncing footwork. So in terms of bouncing, you know, it's like this sort of style. I'm just going to cut to a couple of clips of the bouncing footwork being used in MMA and other combat sports, just because sometimes people have a little bit of a blank when you start mentioning the bouncing. So the bouncing footwork is another topic generally. I think techniques such as a side kick, spinning back kick, punches, mainly punches really if you're going to be thinking of using it in combat sports as a staple. Those are the moves that I think really work well with that style of bouncing footwork. But to bring it back to the front kick, going back to the point about the stance, if you are wondering, if you've tried some front kicks and you don't think it's a good move, you don't think it's working for me, then it is worth paying attention to the stance that you generally tend to use and seeing if that's perhaps why you've not been having much success with the front kick, as well as potentially practicing it more. And I do think if you're competing in kickboxing, Sanda, MMA, it is worth practicing the stance such as this and having some proficiency with it, simply because you never know which opponent you're going to get. You might be facing a lot of guys who have a very weak sort of power roundhouse kick or leg kick, you know, orthodox to orthodox, and then the day could suddenly happen where you come up against someone and he just goes to town on your legs, and you're going to want to make an adaptation to sort of stem the tides of the number of roundhouse kicks that you're taking. So I do think it is worth, even if, you know, you're not going to use it from the get-go, you know, I definitely wouldn't recommend coming out in an MMA bout like that from the start, but I still think it's worth having some proficiency using that stance, just in case you do come across against that style of opponent. So one move that works well with a front kick is a turning kick. That's going to be slightly different from a roundhouse kick, which swings in from the side. So that'll start off, leads with the knee through the center line. So you see from that perspective how it starts to look like a front kick from the start. But then instead, you're going to turn to one side to chamber, and then you'll bring your leg up and hit the target. Now, I would say that move, the turning kick in general, is only effective as a method of targeting the head. Simply because against the head, even if you strike with a foot, that's still going to be powerful enough to do enough damage. And also because if you swing with a turning kick to the body or to the leg, then if you saw UFC 241 the other week, you saw Anthony Pettis. He went for a leg kick against Nate Diaz. He made a mistake for some reason, and he connected with his foot against Diaz's shin, and immediately his foot swelled up, and he was almost TKO'd on the spot, but he persevered throughout the bout, but his movement was severely debilitated. So if you come in with a turning kick to the leg or to the body, then first of all, it's a bit more of a flicky style kick as well. And secondly, you run the risk of them blocking with their shin, and that's going to do serious damage to your foot. And I'm just going to cut to a clip of Glaube Feitosa using a very similar setup. He's finding a home for his front kick, and then eventually he goes for a feint and brings that to the head. He does it with a question mark kick instead of a turning kick. There's a very similar setup in that you can see the opponent has been dummied by the front kick because they think another front kick is coming, but instead the switch happens and you come up with a question mark kick to the head. So another method of doing the front kick is if you can time the opponent balancing on one leg for whatever reason. Now this can either be because you've done a feint, so they've gone to check a kick and then it comes in with a front kick, or because they're throwing a kick, probably a roundhouse kick of their own, and you've timed that and intercepted. So I'm just going to cut to a couple of clips of that being done at the highest levels. A final clip that I think is worth being aware of and seeing is Semmy Schilt using the front snap kick version of it. I personally prefer the push variation of the front kick, but for those who question the power of the technique, you'll see using a front snap kick to the body, Semmy Schilt can cause a TKO on the spot in some of his bouts. It's worth being aware that he is a heavyweight competing against other heavyweights, but he is one of the biggest heavyweights, so he has a size advantage there. I'm not sure how he gets as much power as he does out of it, but he undoubtedly causes a TKO, so that is something worth bearing in mind, that you can, pretty much cause a one punch, effectively one kick TKO out of the front snap kick version of it, if you're as skilled as Semmy Schilt. So that concludes my front kick tutorial. Thank you for watching, and go out and try it in sparring.